to welcome you this I'd like to open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 5. Our key text for this evening will be coming from the intro to the Sermon on the Mount. Do you like introductions? When you meet someone new, do you like that process, or do you feel like it's kind of an awkward exchange? What do you typically do when you meet someone new? Well, you tell them your name, you ask them their name, and then you kind of go down this list of facts about yourself. Oh, well, where are you from? Well, what brings you to the area? What do you do for work? Do you like sports? What kind of hobbies do you have? And we tend to run out of things to talk about pretty quickly. At my workplace, whenever someone new joins the team, which seems to happen a lot, they're there and it's their first day, and then whoever's training them, it's kind of funny. There's this tradition, and they kind of walk them around to everybody's cubicle, and it's just this awkward shuffle where they just go from one person's cubicle to the next, and you hear the same conversation played out about 12 times before they get to you. Where are you from? Where'd you go to school? Okay, nice to meet you. And then next cubicle. Well, Matthew chapter 5 contains an introduction of sorts, but it's not necessarily a personal introduction. It's an introduction to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And I'm going to spend the entire lesson this evening just focused on this introductory portion that we commonly call the Beatitudes. Jesus is debuting his message, and it seems to be early on in his preaching ministry, at least in the order of things as Matthew records it. Jesus has just called his apostles. He's really just begun his ministry, and now his teaching begins. A little bit of background into the Sermon on the Mount. This sermon is, if you think about it, this is probably the first time most people who heard Jesus, this is probably the first thing most of them ever heard him say. Most of the people who would have come out to see Jesus had never heard him speak before, didn't really know anything about him going into this meeting, this sermon, and also consider that for many people, this may be the one and only time they got to hear Jesus preach. The crowds of people were probably a rotating mix. There were some who probably stuck close to Jesus, and once they heard him, they kept coming and they stayed with him and they wanted to hear every word this man had to say. But there were constantly new people coming in, and Jesus would go to a new location and start the whole process over. My personal belief is that the Sermon on the Mount was probably a lesson that Jesus repeated many, many times. He probably used the same points, the same intros, the same delivery of this message with some changes depending on where he was. I think he reused and restated this sermon many times over. And this is possibly the one and only sermon that many people ever got to hear from Jesus' own mouth. Think about that. There's actually evidence that Jesus repeated these messages. If you look in Luke chapter 6, there's a repeat of some of the Beatitudes in that chapter. Only he's not speaking on a mountain. It says he's speaking in a valley. So we know that it's not the same occasion, yet Jesus is making some of the same points. And we call these intro verses the Beatitudes. It has nothing to do with the Scriptures. It's not a Scripture word. The Beatitudes is simply called that because in the Latin Vulgate Bible, when all of these verses start with blessed are, that was the Latin word. It had the same beginning, so they called it the Beatitudes just because of the Latin translation. So it actually really has nothing to do with Jesus or the original text at all. It's just one of those churchy words like we talked about in class this morning. We'll read through them all. It's not a long passage, and then we'll take it in chunks and go through it again in a little more detail. In Matthew chapter 5, let's read starting in verse 1. When he saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain. After he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to teach them by saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to them. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to them. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil things about you falsely on account of me. Rejoice and be glad, because your reward is great in heaven, for they persecuted the prophets before you in the same way. All right, so that's the extent of the intro, and it might not sound like a typical introduction as you would expect it. But as I looked at these blessings, as I looked at these statements of blessings, or these blessed ones, I find that they fit into a few groups, and I'd like to talk about those this evening. The first group speaks of attributes of the kinds of people that Jesus is looking for. And I think the first 4 of the Beatitudes all fit into this category. We'll start in verse 3 with, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to them." The kingdom is theirs. So who are the poor in spirit? So these are people who, if you look at some of the origins of the words, they are spiritual beggars. These are people who are spiritually destitute. They are spiritually in need. By saying that these people are poor in spirit, Jesus isn't emphasizing that they are physically poor. He's not talking about their financial status of whether they come to him or not. It's worth noting that Jesus did appeal to the poor. His message attracted those who were really not included in society because they were among the poor. Jesus didn't discount them. But that's not really what he's talking about here. Nor are these people spiritually poor because they are somehow lacking in character. Poor in spirit doesn't mean they are of poor character, they are bad people. Rather, this poor in spirit is peoples whose spirits are wanting. Their spirits feel a need and are seeking to have that need filled. They are hungry. They are looking for something for their spirit. And the promise that's given, the response, the blessing that's given to the poor in spirit is a contrast to their need. He says theirs is the kingdom of heaven, or the kingdom of heaven belongs to them. And we'll see it over and over that I think Jesus uses a little bit of hyperbole in this statement. That is to say, he's kind of using exaggerated language, or language that really shows the contrast of, you come to me poor in spirit and I give you a kingdom. Someone who is poor, someone who is a beggar, is going to receive a kingdom. You can't think of anything more opposite than that. It's a stark turnaround. So that's the first in this group. Then verse 4, "Blessed are the mourning," or "blessed are those that mourn, for they will be comforted." So now Jesus turns his attention to people who are mourning. And what are these people mourning? What is being mourned here in this verse? I think there's a few possibilities. There's probably a wide net that you could cast. It could be that they are people who are mourning some sort of loss or some sort of sadness or event in their life, something that has left them feeling hopeless, left them feeling sad. To many of the people that Jesus was speaking to, they would have felt a strong sense of national mourning, or a mourning as a people. The people of Israel were an occupied nation when Jesus was born among them. They suffered under the Roman rule. They were persecuted by the Romans, who treated them as an oppressed second-class citizens. They weren't afforded all of the luxuries of society that the Roman Empire may have guaranteed, because they were a colony in essence. So maybe there's a mourning over that, but I think more than anything else, this mourning that Jesus is speaking to, and the reason I say this is because it seems to match the character of the rest of these Beatitudes, is a sorrow for sin, a mourning for the state of one's own soul. Their soul is in a state of loss. Their soul is in a state of death, and they are sorrowful because of that. They know that they need healing, and they need something. And the promise to those that mourn is a very simple one, but it is a beautiful one when it is contrasted with the idea of mourning. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. When someone is feeling mourning, they want comfort. They want someone to know that they feel the sorrow that they are feeling. Someone who can sympathize with the sorrow that they are feeling. And Jesus says, "Blessed are you who mourn, because I know your pain. I know you are sorrowful." And Jesus is saying there is hope for relief. You will be comforted. Again, it's a very stark contrast. Jesus basically takes the attitude of that person coming to them and flips it on its head. You come to me mourning, I promise you comfort. Let's turn to verse 5. next in these intros is, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." And meekness here speaks to gentleness. It is an opposite attribute to self-assertedness. If you needed to look at an opposite, sometimes that helps in understanding a word, is what's the opposite of this word? The opposite of meek, someone who is self-assured, someone who is overly confident. I referenced, it was called the Blue Letter Bible Concordance, and it had a blurb. It said that the word stems from a trust in God's goodness and trust in God's control over the situation. So meekness is a willingness to say, I don't need to exert my strength or my power because I trust God's control over the situation. That's someone who's meek. And I think a really great contrast of this meekness is, think about the people who stood opposed to Jesus while he was preaching. Were they meek? The people who were opposed to Jesus were religious people who were very confident that they knew better the words of God than this teacher who, in their eyes, came out of nowhere and was making blasphemous claims. The Pharisees or the priests, the scribes, the rulers of the people, they were not meek because they were self-assertive. They were sure of themselves and sure of their knowledge that this Messiah figure, this teacher in the wilderness, he was not matching up to the picture of, this is not what the prophets were talking about. This is not how it's supposed to be, and they were sure of that. Jesus is saying here that he is a blessing to people who will hear the words of God without inserting their own assertiveness on top of it. People who will hear the words of God honestly and openly and without layering their own preconceived notions on top of it and allow themselves to be changed by the words of God. That's meekness. That's gentleness. What is the reward given to the meek? Again, another one of these total flip-flops. They will inherit the earth. Now, you may look at that and wonder, that could be seen as a little confusing. So I want to talk about that a little bit. Inherit the earth. What does Jesus mean by that? Does that mean that literally the planet is going to be the possession of people who are meek? I don't think so. I think the point Jesus is making here is, again, using a word image, using this extreme picture in our heads to show us what's the least thing you would expect someone who is gentle and not self-assertive to be given? The world, right? They lived in a time when the world was routinely conquered. Alexander the Great conquered the world. The Persian Empire conquered the world. The Roman Empire conquered the world as they knew it. So possessing the world was not a very unfamiliar thing, and there's plenty of men today who still want to possess the world and conquer the world. And Jesus says, those men are self-assertive. Those men do it by their strength. Those men do it by their leadership. But it's not going to them. Jesus says, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are the gentle, for they will inherit the earth. It's just a complete reversal of what you would expect someone to receive from meekness. And finally, in verse 6, to end out this first section, people who hunger and thirst for righteousness. He says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. In thinking about this hungering and thirsting for righteousness, the first thing that came to my mind was perhaps a sense of righteous justice or longing for justice. People who want to see God's will carried out. And I think that that is contained in this. I think that that's part of this. But it's also, I think, just a people who are looking for God. People who are motivated to seek God out. People who, if you ask them the question, do you want to serve God? It's an emphatic yes. They don't even have to think about it. They don't even have to, why would you even ask me that? Of course I want to serve God. I think that's what's shown here in this hungering for righteousness, hungering and thirsting for righteousness. It's as if they need it. It's as if their survival depends on, of course I must serve God. Of course I must seek Him out. There were plenty of Jews in this time period who did, upon meeting Jesus, they enthusiastically realized, this is where I need to go to seek out God. Look at the response of the apostles, of Andrew and Peter and James and John. Once they heard their enthusiasm in going and telling their brothers and their friends and the people they knew, the assuredness with which the passion with which they said, "Come and see who we found. We found the Messiah. We have found the Christ." They were hungering and thirsting for righteousness, and when they saw it, they pursued it. They answered strongly, "Yes, that is what I want to seek." And what's the blessing promised to those who hunger? Satisfaction. They will be satisfied. Jesus is saying, if you will seek out God, if you will honestly say to yourself, "Yes, I want to pursue righteousness. I want to find God. I want to seek God," Jesus promises you will find what you're looking for and you won't be disappointed. That is the promise of satisfaction. So taking these first four sort of as a chunk, I see these as Jesus is sitting down at the start of his teaching, and he's putting the invitation at the beginning, if you think of it that way. We always put the invitation at the end. Jesus is starting out his whole teaching by saying, all right, listen, who is this for? Who am I speaking to? Who am I looking for right now? I'm looking for the people who are poor in spirit. I'm looking for you people who are meek. I'm looking for the people who are mourning. I'm looking for the people who are hungering for God. If that's you, then listen to me. Jesus is setting the stage and letting these people know who he's looking for. It's an invitation. I think that that's what Jesus does with these first verses. He really sets the stage. And, someone who can't fit that bill, someone who doesn't fit that category, they would soon come to find that, they're not going to jive with the message that Jesus has for them. Plenty would not. Now in verses 7 and 9, I think Jesus changes gears a little bit, slightly. He now directs blessings toward the types of actions that are taken by people who are his. Look in verse 7. "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy." So here, he starts out with mercy. You might expect Jesus to launch into what kind of grand or mighty deeds he expects his people to do, but not so. Mercy is not a mighty deed. Mercy is not a powerful deed as the world thinks of power. Mercy is even seen as weakness in many cases. But mercy is to extend favor and pardon to someone who is undeserving. It is a humble act. Mercy is fundamentally a humble act, and it shows a self-awareness. I think mercy requires a self-awareness. We have to know that we received mercy the same. We have to know that we were in need of mercy, and thus we show mercy to others. That's what Jesus asks of his followers. He would say essentially the same in other lessons that he gave later on. Psalm 103 also has a discussion of mercy, and I wanted to read this because I didn't want to give the impression that Jesus is inventing something new out of whole cloth. Some people look at the Old Testament and they think, the Old Testament is about judgment and justice and law, and then the New Testament, Jesus came and it was, mercy and love and flowers and rainbows and all that. I don't want to give that impression, because listen to Psalm 103. This is an excerpt from verses 8 through 11. "The Lord is compassionate and merciful. He is patient and demonstrates great loyal love. He does not always accuse and does not stay angry. He does not deal with us as our sins deserve. He does not repay us as our misdeeds deserve. For as the skies are high above the earth, so his loyal love towers over his faithful followers." And there were many psalms I could have gone to, but I chose this one because I think it reflects the fact that mercy has always been among the traits of God. So when Jesus is calling them out to show mercy, they know what that means. He's not asking them something that they've never heard of before. I also liked that picture that's painted in the Psalms of God's loyal love and his mercy towering over his faithful followers. We think of towering over as sort of an imposing choice of words. That's a strange metaphor. And as strange as it sounds, the example I can think of is Disney World. If you've ever been to Disney World, and bear with me a little bit, there's a castle in Disney World, right? And so wherever you are, you can look around and you can find that castle. And that castle is in the middle of the park. So even if you're all the way out on the outskirts, you're like, how do I get back to the main gate? You look for the castle, and you can find it. There's a term, I can't remember it now, but architectural engineers use this term of like it's a waypoint, it's a sight line, it's something that you can see as a physical marker so you don't lose sight of it and you don't forget it. That is what God's mercy is. It's a tower that wherever you find yourself, you can look and you can see it. And it reminds you that that's the nature of God, that we were not treated as our sins deserved. The blessing that's told to the merciful is very straightforward. They will receive mercy. And I think that this reflection is a nod to the fact that in order to show mercy, we have to realize that we needed mercy. Those who show mercy receive mercy, and this is an idea that's echoed frequently in Jesus' words later on, and even in this very sermon. Next, in verse 8, the next action that people take when they are followers of Jesus. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. One who is pure in heart does not have an ulterior motive. They don't have corruption. They don't have a hidden agenda. They're not trying to serve themselves or hide or reserve sin for themselves. A pure heart is an exposed heart. A pure heart is one that is not hidden, but is fully open to God. It is laid bare, and it is surrendered to God's sight. And what is the blessing promised to the pure in heart? The pure in heart will see God. Now, you could look at all of these, and maybe you could argue that's the best one of them all, right? That's the greatest blessing. Brace, in his lesson this morning, asked us to ponder what it really means to see God, to be in His presence. It truly is a remarkable blessing. But I think Jesus, he's sticking with the pattern. There's kind of a twist of words here, if you think about it. I'm telling you that a pure heart is an exposed heart. A pure heart is a visible, transparent, upfront, no lies, what you see is what you get heart. And God says to them, blessed are those who have a pure in heart, for they will see God. If you expose yourself to God, God will reveal Himself to you. If you are honest with God, you will see an honest picture of who God is. If you reveal yourself, then God will not be hidden from your sight. It's when we are controlled by our secrets, controlled by our lies, that we can't see God because of the smoke screen that we've put up around our lives. But when we can clear away the screen, when we can clear away the smoke, God becomes visible. They will see God. And finally, verse 9. An action taken by God's followers. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And this word peacemakers, I don't remember if there was some book or if there was like a lesson series at one point that was all about peacemakers. I feel like you used to hear about peacemakers a lot. I don't know if you hear about that so much anymore. But I don't know about you, but when I hear peacemakers, the first thing I think of is a peacekeeping operation. You know, you ever heard terms like that? And our world tends to think of peacekeeping as an interventionalist kind of practice. There's people arguing right now that what's going on in Venezuela is peacekeeping. You know, we're there to liberate people. And it's like, well, ask all the other countries that we've liberated over the decades how well that went for them. And that's all I'll say about that. No, I think this is something else. Because peacekeeping is not I'm here to make peace and I'm going to make it happen. Ultimately, being peaceable depends on a very personal decision and a personal way that we conduct ourselves, I would argue. In Romans chapter 12, verse 18, Paul would say, as much as it depends on you, live peaceably with all men. So peacekeeping is on me. Peacekeeping is not on this party and this party need to shake hands and sign the treaty and we need to make buddies here. That's something else. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. But being a peacemaker starts with you. It starts with what you can control and what you can own. It's when someone resolves to fix their own disputes, thus making peace. Later on in this very same sermon, Jesus would give another example of this peacekeeping. And I think this is the reason why I think this is what Jesus is talking about here. He says later in the sermon, if you're going to give your gift, but you have a dispute with your brother, what does he say to do? Lay aside your gift, delay that service, that act of worship, because it's not going to It's not going to work out if you're harboring this in your heart. Lay that gift aside and go and resolve your dispute with your brother. It is a personal action. Peacekeeping is not something you do with a gun. Peacekeeping is not something you do with threats or violence or force or bribes or anything like that. Peacekeeping is when you resolve to fix what you can, control what you can, and that is yourself. You can't control anyone else or anything else in this world but yourself and the choices you make. So, looking back on those three, what are the actions of Jesus' followers, the people that he expects? They're merciful, they're pure in heart, and they're peacekeepers. So finally, Jesus gives the last two blessings. They are aimed at the people who will follow him to the end, who will follow him through anything, the people who will hold firm. That's who Jesus is looking for, even when faced with real hardship. We'll look at these together, starting in verse 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to them. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil things about you falsely on account of me. Rejoice and be glad, because your reward is great in heaven, for they persecuted the prophets before you in the same way. Think about how Jesus was insulted and mocked and disbelieved. And when we think of Jesus being mocked, maybe your mind goes to the cross. But think earlier than that. Jesus, throughout his entire life, dealt with people who would insult him. He was called, "Oh, you were born out of utter sin." He was called an illegitimate child. He was called from a people from a land where nothing good could come out of that land. He was a simpleton in their eyes. He was just some blue-collar guy. He doesn't know how to study the law. He hasn't been to rabbinical school. Who is he to speak with authority on these things? Jesus endured all of that. He was disbelieved. And maybe some of us have felt a feeling of being reviled by the world. I can't say out of personal experience that I feel like I've ever been insulted for being a Christian or that I've ever been mocked for being a Christian. Sometimes we get a little sensitive about things and we find persecution where I personally don't believe persecution exists. Please take note that what's being talked about here, this insulting, this reviling, this is not the same thing as Christians doing ugly and horrible things and the world calling them out on it. That happens a lot, and that is not persecution. That is the world seeing hypocrisy and calling it what it is. No, rather, it is when the world mocks you for the attributes that Jesus is talking about here. Are we mocked or are we reviled for surrendering to Christ? Are we mocked for mourning our sinfulness? Sometimes the world says, you shouldn't beat yourself up over sins, or that's not even wrong. People bear this false guilt because what you're doing is not sinful. That could be an example. Are we mocked for our meekness and not being self-assertive? Is mercy mocked or reviled by the world? I think you can find examples where these traits, remember looking at the higher up list of those Beatitudes, those traits do find instances where they are mocked. Jesus is saying to these people, the promise to them is similar in both. The kingdom of heaven belongs to them. And in verse 12, your reward is great in heaven. Jesus is telling them that if you can weather through this, if you will come to me, if you will heed that invitation to listen to my sermon, and if you will stick to it despite the hardship that it will cause you, you will be rewarded. You will be rewarded greatly. He says the prophets endured the same, and you will be counted like them. So as we wrap up, I want to give some closing thoughts on these blessings that Jesus gives. Like I said in the beginning, I think these blessings serve as an introduction to the larger sermon that's recorded for us in Matthew chapter 5 and then the following chapters. And it's a highly, highly radical sermon that Jesus gives. It is a sermon that turns things on its head for many of the people who heard it. And the reality is it remains a radical sermon today. Jesus' sermon would turn over power structures and flip-flop what people thought the right order of things ought to be. The principles of submission and gentleness and forgiveness, these were hard for many people to swallow because it wasn't how they had experienced religion up to that point. Jesus said, I come to fulfill the law. I don't come to destroy the law, but I come to fulfill it. That was a radical thing for Jesus to say. Jesus, in this sermon, to follow these Beatitudes, would ask for their hearts, not just their obedience to the letter of the law. He talks about that in the passages on do not be angry with your brother, do not lust. Merely lusting is what Jesus doesn't want us to do, not just not committing the sin of adultery, but don't even lust. He's after our hearts. That was a radical part of that sermon. Jesus would say in this sermon not to take vengeance and instead to love your enemy. That is an almost impossible sermon to try to convince people of in any day and age, I think. Jesus preaches humble and honest religion is not your service in the temple, but it's giving and it's in prayer. It's in those simple acts of charity and goodness toward other people. And I asked Jim to read from Matthew chapter 7, which is still a continuation of this sermon. You might think it odd that the reading didn't come from our main passage, but the reason I did that is because I think that there's a reflection of how Jesus introed later on. Remember how I said I think the Beatitudes are an invitation. I think the Beatitudes are a come to me if this sounds like you kind of intro. And then Jesus in chapter 7, verse 7 says, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks the door will be opened. Is there anyone among you who, if his son asks for bread, you will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will you give him a snake? If you then, although you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? That could be a good parallel to this morning's lesson on how God gives more even than what we ask. Ask him. Bring your petitions to God. Verse 12, in everything, treat others as you would want them to treat you, for this fulfills the law and the prophets. And then he says, enter through the narrow gate, because the gate is wide and the way is spacious that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it. But the gate is narrow and the way is difficult that leads to life, and there are few who find it. Jesus wants to be found by these people. Jesus says, seek me out, ask for me, seek me, come to me. He wants to be found, but he also says that there is a wide and full crowded road of people who are missing out. People who are missing the point because they think being a Christian means something else altogether. They think being a follower of Christ means power. It means vengeance. It means getting the kingdom back by force. And Jesus, in his wisdom, is introing his sermon to say, if that's what you're looking for, that's not what I'm looking for. I am not looking for that. Jesus never hid this. He never made it a secret. He never made it hard to understand what he was really about. He did it from day one when he started his ministry. I've heard many Christian voices and authors argue. There's kind of a popularity, and sometimes it's called in like evangelical circles. There's sort of a popular movement. I just read a book on this, so it's fresh in my mind. Christians are warriors. Christians are to be strong. Christians are to be fierce, even dangerous. I read a book once. Go to any popular Christian bookstore, look at books on masculinity and Christian manhood, and you will find authors that say men need to be dangerous and fierce and really use that violent power that's within them. And I read one of those books once, and I did not relate to very much of it at all. Because when you look at sermons like these, where do you find that person? And they'll say, oh, Jesus has been, turned into this sissy. Jesus has been turned into this soft character that he never was. Jesus was hard. Jesus was rough. Jesus had muscles. And they'll try to persuade you of this. Read this sermon. Read Jesus' own words. And where do you get that? Where do you get that? I don't find that anywhere. Meekness and mercy and bearing ourselves before God. If you're talking about masculine traits, those aren't feminine traits. Those are Christian traits. Men or women, it doesn't matter. couple other ways to apply this list. I don't think the Beatitudes are a list of commands. When you look at these, they're not given as do this, do this, do this kind of statements. They are, if you are this, you're blessed. If you are this, you're blessed. These are a set of ideals. They're a set of attributes. They are things to pursue. But I don't want us to look at these and feel this dread that, well, I've done 1 through 7, but I haven't done 8 and 9 of these. Don't look at it this way. Look at it as Jesus is asking for these traits. He's looking for these traits. And if you have them, then you know that Jesus has promised you'll be blessed. And finally, consider these passages when you're introing someone to Christ. I said in the beginning that this is an introduction. This is how Jesus debuted his message to people who had never heard him before. So when you're trying to introduce someone to Christ, consider these passages. Consider using the Beatitudes and the following Sermon on the Mount. Continue the reading. If they're still interested, keep right on reading. And what you will give those people, if you start here, is probably the purest expression of what Jesus was about. The most simple and pure way that Jesus taught. You know, there were figures throughout history. This has been repeated over and over. I think the famous quote's been attributed to Gandhi, the Indian independence leader Gandhi. He once was attributed to say, I like your Christ, I just don't like your Christians. So even he could look at the simple, plain message of Christ and say, yes, you know, this is goodness, this is mercy, this is admirable and honorable stuff that Jesus is preaching. So consider that. You know, we're looking ahead to a year where our theme is going to be aimed a little bit more around broadcasting the message of Jesus to other people. And so I think that the Beatitudes is a very plain and simple place to start. It is an approachable place to start. This is a place to begin if you want to find out whether someone will love Jesus or not. Is do they love and resonate with the message that Jesus is preaching? That's what Jesus did with these Beatitudes. He was kind of screening who's going to be interested in me and who's not. And that's the same thing that we can use these passages for. The structure of religion, it has its place. Jesus talked about it. But frequently it obscures what really the core message of Jesus is all about and what he wants people to understand. So just simplify things and keep right on into the sermon if it's working out well. That would be my advice on how to use these passages with someone who's new to Christ or doesn't know Christ at all. Well, as we end this evening, I want to thank you for your attention. These blessings, these blessed ones, I never knew what to call them. I made a slide, by the way, and then I messed up, so you didn't get to see it. It was just one slide. But I didn't know what to call this lesson. Do I call it the Beatitudes? And I kind of fell out of favor with that word because it's just a churchy word. It's just a linguistic word. So I was like, do I call it the blessings, the blessed ones, the ones Jesus blessed? I don't know. Call it what you want. You decide for yourselves. I'll call them the blessings. If you look at these blessings, Jesus wants a simple heart. He wants a simple and pure coming to him. So if you're looking for something, if you're mourning the state that you're in, if you feel a sadness because your soul is at a loss, your soul is lost, Jesus is asking, are you interested in me? Are you interested in having that reversed? Because I can do it. Jesus can do it. There's more to learn about Jesus than just what we find here, but that's why we have the rest of Scripture. That's why we have the rest of the Gospels. Take this as a litmus test for what a Christian really is. And then when we introduce ourselves to people, how much do we introduce ourselves by, I'm a Christian? Do we tell people what being a Christian really means? Because I think much of the world really needs a refresher on what being a Christian means. That word has got a lot of baggage tied to it now over the years, and it's passages like these that can really cut through all that baggage and get it back to a simple and pure message that I think everyone can understand. If we can help you in any way this evening, we want to do so. We want you to make your life right with Christ. And it's passages like these that help us realize it is very simple. And when you really sit and think into yourself and meditate into yourself and meditate with God, the answers come to you. You realize what you need. You realize that you need saving. You need a Savior, and Jesus promises that. If we can help you in any other way, if there's prayers or intervention we can make with you and sit with you or just listen to you, any one of us is willing to help. Please let us know how we can help while we stand and while we sing.